Daniel Morgan wasn't supposed to be home that day. The flight from Boston landed early. The last meeting had been canceled, and instead of heading to the office or texting the nanny, he told the driver to take him straight home. No warning, no pretense, just a quiet impulse that said, "Go to your son." The taxi barely came to a stop in front of the Manhattan high-rise before Daniel tossed a crumpled wad of bills onto the front seat and stepped out, leaving the door swinging. The driver shouted something about change. Daniel didn't hear it. He was already pushing through the revolving glass door into the lobby. "Mr. Morgan?" the doorman called after him, slightly startled. "Back already?" Daniel just nodded and kept walking. His footsteps echoed across the polished marble floor. Elevator doors slid open without hesitation. 31 floors up. His heart thudded louder with each level climbed. It had been a week. 7 days of hotel rooms, investor meetings, medical check-ins via phone, and that creeping guilt that hollowed him from the inside out. Ethan had been his whole world since the accident. 2 years ago, Emma died instantly on a rainy night on the FDR. Daniel had survived the impact with little more than bruises. But nothing had touched him since with less than a blade. Ethan was all he had left. And now, even that fragile thread had begun to fray. Leukemia, 8 months of brutal treatment, hair loss, mood swings, needle marks. The quiet way his son now sat through pain without flinching. Daniel had learned to measure hope in test results and hospital corridors. Until today, he approached the apartment door with the usual fatigue of routine. And then he stopped. Something was off. Laughter. Ethan's laughter. High-pitched, pure, unfiltered. Daniel froze. It wasn't the weak laugh of politeness he'd grown used to when Ethan tried to make his father feel better. This was the real thing. He hadn't heard that sound in months. There was another voice too. A woman's. Light, warm, and unfamiliar. She spoke gently, her tone teasing, playful. Not medical. Not maternal. Something else. Daniel leaned closer. Inside, he heard a buzzing sound. Then more laughter. Something clattered. A gasp. He turned the knob slowly and pushed the door open just a crack. The scene inside stopped him cold. Ethan was perched cross-legged on his bed, wearing his favorite blue Superman t-shirt. His cheeks were flushed with laughter, hands clapping gleefully. And in front of him, kneeling on the floor, was Claire Bennett, the nanny he'd hired 3 weeks ago. A practical choice. She came with good recommendations. Quiet, professional, empathetic eyes. Daniel hadn't paid her much attention beyond the paperwork. Until now, Claire held a pair of electric clippers in one hand. Her uniform apron was dusted with strands of chestnut brown hair. But she wasn't shaving Ethan's head. She was shaving her own. Long locks fell to the floor like leaves in autumn, collecting around her knees. "There we go, my little Superman soldier," she said softly, running her fingers across her newly shaven scalp with a brave smile. "Now we really match." Ethan squealed with delight. "Miss Claire, you look like a cool alien, like a space superhero." Daniel's suitcase slipped from his hand and landed with a muted thud. The noise caught their attention. Claire turned, calmly. No panic, no flinch, just a flicker of surprise that softened instantly into quiet certainty. Her eyes met his. They didn't apologize. They didn't challenge. They simply held his gaze. "I can explain," she said gently. "But please just look at him." Daniel looked. Ethan's eyes sparkled. His whole face was lit from within. He looked, for the first time in months, like a little boy again. Not a patient, not a prognosis. Just Ethan. Daniel stepped inside slowly, his eyes never leaving Claire's. "Why?" he asked. "Why would you do that?" She stood slowly and placed the clippers on the dresser. A few strands of hair clung stubbornly to her shoulder. Her voice was steady, if a bit raw. "Because I remember what it felt like to watch someone I love go through this. I had a younger brother, Michael. He was 17 when he was diagnosed. We didn't have anyone. I took care of him for 2 years. And in that time, I learned how isolating illness is. How it strips kids of more than their health. It takes their confidence, their identity. People stare. People avoid you. And one day, Michael said he didn't recognize himself anymore." Daniel said nothing. The room felt suspended in time. "I brought clippers to the hospital," Claire continued, "and I shaved my head in front of him. He laughed, really laughed, for the first time in months. He said now we were a team. It didn't save him, but it gave him something back." Her voice trembled. I saw that same look in Ethan. That quiet sadness. The weight of being different. I couldn't stand it. Daniel looked at her like he was seeing a stranger, but one who'd wandered into his life, carrying something sacred. Then she said the thing that stopped his breath. Mr. Morgan, I don't think Ethan is as sick as they've told you. He blinked. What? Claire stepped closer, not urgent, but precise. I've been watching him. How he plays. How he moves. His reflexes, his stamina, his color, his appetite. I know what terminal leukemia looks like. And Ethan doesn't look like it. Daniel's face tightened. He's in the final stage. We've seen over 15 specialists. I'm not saying they're all wrong, Claire replied. But what if one of them was? What if someone made a mistake? Or worse, what if it wasn't a mistake at all? Daniel stared at her. Let me take him somewhere. One test. One independent hospital. A lab that has no connection to your current doctors. What's the harm? He hesitated. Then he looked at Ethan. His son was now humming quietly, drawing aliens in a sketchbook with a green marker. The bald head gleamed under the ceiling light, but his face was alive, electric. He turned back to Claire. Do it. And with those two words, the axis of his world began to shift. 2 days later, Daniel Morgan found himself staring out the window of a private car as the Boston skyline drifted past. The ride was quiet, tense. Claire sat in the back seat beside Ethan, who was gleefully explaining why Spider-Man was cooler than Iron Man, using a logic only a 6-year-old could invent. Daniel barely heard it. His mind was elsewhere, stuck in the cold logic of numbers, reports, prognosis charts. The 15 doctors he had consulted hadn't all been fools. Some were the best in the city. Yet here he was, trusting a nanny with a shaved head and a quiet voice more than a parade of white coats. It wasn't logic. It was something older than that. The hospital Claire had suggested was St. Mary's, a pediatric institution known for its independence, both in its funding and its lab work. She had chosen it carefully. No ties to their previous doctors. No shared labs. Just one thing, clean data. In the waiting room, Daniel's anxiety came to a boil. He checked his watch, then his phone, then his watch again. Claire, meanwhile, remained unervingly calm. She knelt beside Ethan as a nurse called his name. Ready, soldier? She whispered. Ethan nodded, gripping her hand. The tests were quick. Blood drawn. Vitals taken. A new oncologist, someone who had never met Daniel, never heard of Dr. Richard Hale, never seen Ethan's old file, walked in holding a tablet. Mr. Morgan, he said, scanning the screen. I don't know how to say this delicately, so I'll be direct. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Your son is not terminal. In fact, his current test results show no active leukemia cells at all. Every marker is within normal range. If I had no prior history, I would consider him in complete remission. Time stopped. Daniel slumped into the nearest chair, his hands trembling. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, searching for words that refused to come. But the other tests, he finally said, hoarse. They said, every one of them, stage 4. Irreversible. He was supposed to. The doctor raised an eyebrow. If that's the case, I strongly suggest reviewing those records. But based on what I'm seeing now, Ethan isn't dying. He's recovering. Claire closed her eyes and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Ethan looked up, puzzled. Dad, are you crying again? He asked. Daniel laughed through the tears. Yeah, buddy, but not the sad kind. For the rest of the afternoon, Daniel was a ghost moving through corridors of light. The hospital confirmed and reconfirmed the numbers. No trace of disease progression. No chemotherapy needed. No palliative care. No death sentence. And yet, a question pounded through Daniel's mind like a drumbeat. How? How had every test before this said the opposite? What had they been treating? What had he been made to believe? The next morning, back in Manhattan, Daniel retrieved Ethan's past test results from Dr. Hale's office. He requested full lab records. When they arrived, he spread them across his desk and compared them to the St. Mary's report. The difference wasn't subtle. It was staggering. The old reports, from a lab affiliated directly with Hale, showed abnormal white blood cell counts, signs of marrow suppression, and irreversible disease progression. Words that had hung over Daniel's head like tombstones. The new report from Boston? Normal white cell counts. No suppression. No abnormalities. And then a slow, cold realization crawled up his spine. If one of these was true, the other had to be a lie. He sat there for hours, papers strewn around him, the weight of months pressing on his chest. Every injection, every sick day, every night Ethan cried in his sleep. Every morning, he had packed a bag for the hospital. What if it had all been unnecessary? Claire entered quietly with tea. She said nothing at first, just placed the cup down and sat across from him. "I think someone falsified your son's results," she said softly. Daniel looked up. "You're saying Dr. Hale lied?" "I'm saying it's possible. I've heard rumors in nursing circles about physicians who prolong treatment unnecessarily. For grants, for prestige, for profit. Most people don't dare to accuse. He's too well connected, too powerful." Daniel leaned back in his chair, hands gripping the armrests until his knuckles whitened. "If you're right," he said quietly, "someone let my son suffer. And I let them." "You trusted them," Claire said. "And now you know better." He stared at the reports again, rage blooming behind his ribs. "What do we do?" Claire met his eyes with calm fire. "We find someone who will help us prove it. Officially." The next day, Claire reached out to Dr. Laura Mitchell, a former professor from her nursing school, now a senior advisor at a national medical oversight board. Mitchell was sharp, blunt, and carried a reputation for surgical precision in both diagnosis and judgment. They met in a small office at St. Mary's. Laura took one look at the files and said 3 words that changed everything. "This isn't new." She explained that Dr. Hale had long operated with minimal oversight. His lab was privately owned. He insisted on controlling all patient diagnostics through it. Several cases over the years had raised suspicions: prolonged chemo schedules, unusually high mortality rates, inconsistent reports, but no family had ever come forward. "Most don't have the energy," Laura said. "They're grieving, or afraid, or told their kid is the exception." Daniel sat in silence. "But you," Laura added, "have something none of them did. Evidence, a contradiction, and a boy who lived." She slid a folder across the table. "These are families I've flagged over the years. Some children passed. Some survived. If we reach out, they might speak." Daniel took the file and opened it slowly. Inside were names, dates, faces. One of them could have been Ethan. And suddenly Daniel realized this wasn't just about his son anymore. This was about every family who had believed a lie. Every child who had suffered for someone else's benefit. He looked up. "Let's begin." 2 days after the Boston diagnosis, Daniel Morgan's penthouse no longer felt like a place of quiet resignation. It had become a command center. Papers blanketed the dining table. Laptops hummed. Test results, emails, schedules. But what struck Daniel most was the sound in the background. Not the cold beeping of hospital machines, but laughter. Ethan's. The boy ran through the living room with a cape fashioned from a towel and a wooden spoon for a sword. Claire watched from the couch, her head still bare, a slight smile on her face. He'd never seen her in anything but that same calm control, until now. Until she watched Ethan become a child again. Then the doorbell rang. Claire stood first. Daniel followed her to the entrance and opened it to find 2 women standing there. One was thin, older, her eyes tired but determined. The other held a boy's hand, a quiet child with short, patchy hair and an air of forced maturity far beyond his 10 years. Claire gestured gently. "Daniel, this is Karen Blake and Melissa Turner. Their children were also treated by Dr. Hale." Daniel invited them in. No small talk. The women sat down like people who had carried too much for too long. Melissa's son, Jacob, stood quietly by the window, watching Ethan play. Karen spoke first. "My daughter, Lily, was diagnosed a year ago. We followed everything Dr. Hale said. Every appointment, every dose. When I questioned the constant chemo, he told me she wasn't responding. When she grew weaker, he said it was the disease. I took her to another doctor for a second opinion 3 months ago." She paused. Her voice cracked. "They said she'd been in remission for nearly 8 months. Daniel didn't move. I kept her on treatment longer than I had to," she whispered. "I let her suffer when she could have been healing. Because I believed him." Melissa took over, her tone sharper. "My son had the same story. We came for preventive treatment. Dr. Hale pushed aggressive cycles. Said it was precautionary. Another doctor said it was unnecessary. He endured months of poison. For nothing." Daniel sat down hard. Claire moved to the table and placed Laura Mitchell's file between them. "There are more," she said. "Families like yours. We've started compiling reports. Medical records. Contradictions." Karen reached into her bag and pulled out a thick bundle. Old invoices. Handwritten notes. Blood test copies. Here's everything, she said. If you're willing to fight, we're with you. Daniel stared at the documents. He wasn't looking at numbers. He was looking at evidence. Evidence of a pattern. One doctor. Dozens of victims. Children used like lab rats. And now, for the first time, the silence had cracked. In the next hour, Lily and Jacob were out back playing with Ethan. There was shouting. Laughter. The kind that made Daniel's throat tighten. Claire watched him from across the room. They've been waiting for someone to go first, she said. Now we're not alone. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. He sat at his desk, staring at the names, the timelines, the false reports, his own signature on treatment consents, his own voice in voicemails, thanking Dr. Hale for his dedication. He opened his laptop and wrote the first email. It went to a journalist, a woman he'd once worked with on a feature for Architectural Digest. Someone with reach. Someone who hated corruption more than most. He didn't use drama. He didn't beg. Just the facts. The reports. And the question, what if we've all been lied to? Within 48 hours, the story hit. Prominent pediatric oncologist accused of prolonging childhood cancer treatment for profit. The headline didn't scream. It didn't need to. TV networks followed. Experts weighed in. Social media erupted. By the end of the week, 34 more families had come forward. Claire fielded calls constantly. Some cried. Some raged. Some just asked, "Can you help?" Then came the day when Daniel answered the phone and saw the name on the screen. Dr. Richard Hale. He answered. "Mr. Morgan." Came the familiar voice, now cooler. "I hear you've taken your son to another hospital." Daniel said nothing. "You realize that's incredibly dangerous for a terminal case, don't you?" Daniel exhaled. Slowly. "He's not terminal. You knew that." Silence. Then a shift in tone. "You're making a serious mistake. If you continue this path, I'll be forced to report you to Child Protective Services. You're denying a child life-saving treatment." Daniel's grip tightened. "You'll never lay a hand on my son again." He hung up. 20 minutes later, the doorbell rang again. 2 plainclothes men. Badges. Child Protective Services. "We've received a report that Mr. Morgan may be withholding medical treatment from his son." Claire handled it. She handed over the ST. Mary's diagnosis, Dr. Carter's report, and recent photos of Ethan, laughing, playing, healthy. The men read everything. Then looked at Ethan, who was running laps around the kitchen island with a foam sword. One of the agents shook his head. "This kid's in better shape than I am." They left 20 minutes later with an apology. Daniel collapsed into the couch, sweat on his brow. Claire sat beside him. "He's not going to stop. Not yet." Daniel looked around the apartment. Toys scattered. Notebooks. Crayons. Signs of life. He met her eyes. "Then neither are we." It was no longer just about Ethan. Within a week of the article's publication, Daniel Morgan's life became something between a courtroom and a newsroom. Journalists called daily. Legal teams volunteered their services. Parents who had once buried their grief alone now stood shoulder to shoulder, voices no longer shaking when they said the name. Dr. Richard Hale. The evidence mounted like sediment. Medical records from dozens of children, all showing the same pattern. Extended treatment beyond remission, inflated blood test markers, suspicious lab inconsistencies. And at the center of it all, one man and one private lab, where numbers had been twisted into prescriptions. Claire handled most of the coordination. She had a notebook that never left her side, pages marked with phone numbers, court references, timelines. She moved through each conversation with quiet, clinical precision, but Daniel knew what it cost her. Every parent's story opened another scar. Every child's name was a ghost she'd once known by another. One afternoon, Claire returned from a meeting with Dr. Laura Mitchell, her face grim. "Laura confirmed something," she said. "The state medical board had flagged Hale's lab practices 3 years ago, but he buried the report with legal pressure. Families backed down. They didn't have the energy to fight." Daniel clenched his jaw. "But now we do." They met in secret with a growing coalition of affected parents. 15, then 27, then 42. The group included lawyers, whistleblowers, and even 2 former lab technicians who admitted to seeing altered results but had been too afraid to speak. At the center of it all, Daniel sat with his arms folded, a quiet figure who had once only wanted to save his son, and now found himself leading something that looked and sounded very much like justice. I trusted him, he said one night, staring at the reports. I shook his hand. I thanked him. And the whole time, he was bleeding my child for numbers and profit. Claire placed her hand over his. You were never blind. You were desperate. That's what he preyed on. Then, in early spring, the tipping point came. Police raided Hale's private lab. Early morning headlines exploded. Renowned pediatric oncologist under criminal investigation. Lab records seized in suspected diagnostic fraud scheme. Dozens of families joined class action lawsuit. The footage was surreal. Dr. Hale, surrounded by flashing cameras, covering his face with a folder as federal agents escorted him down marble steps. No coat, no mask of calm professionalism. Just a man caught, undone. But the most shocking revelation came not from a report, but from a vial. Inside the lab, authorities discovered chemotherapy medication, expired, mislabeled, and in some cases, missing entirely. The implication was monstrous. While real children were being pumped with diluted drugs, the unexpired medications had been siphoned off for black market resale. That evening, the news played on every major channel. Daniel stood in the living room as Ethan and Lily, now permanent fixtures in the household, played behind him. Their laughter, once fragile, now rang out with total, unshakable freedom. Claire entered the room, her phone vibrating nonstop in her hand. Dr. Mitchell just called. The board is moving to revoke his license. There'll be criminal charges, and families from 5 different states are joining the case. Daniel nodded slowly. Good. Then he paused. But it's not over. No, Claire agreed. But the silence is broken. And this time, people are listening. 3 days later, Karen returned with Lily, her eyes filled with something harder than grief, guilt. I've tried, Daniel, she said, voice cracking. I've tried to be okay. But every time I look at her, I see the pain she endured. And I see that I let it happen. Claire moved toward her, but Karen held up a trembling hand. I'm not asking for pity. I'm asking for help. I see how Lily is with you. With Ethan. I see the way she laughs. How she's sleeping through the night. And I'm ashamed to admit it, but I can't give her that anymore. I don't have it in me. Daniel's voice was quiet. What are you asking? Karen placed a small suitcase on the floor. I want her to stay here. If she wants it. I know it's a lot. I know it's unfair. But if you'd let her be part of your family. The words fell into silence. Lily stood near the doorway, watching Ethan draw aliens on the whiteboard. She looked up at Claire, then Daniel, then her mother, and nodded. I want to stay. Karen broke down. Claire caught her before she could collapse into her own grief. You did everything you could, Claire whispered. You brought her this far. We'll take it from here. That night, Daniel tucked both children into bed. Ethan curled under his Star Wars blanket. Lily lay beside him, holding a small stuffed bear. Her hair had just begun to grow back. Her breathing was steady. In the hallway, Daniel paused. Claire was there, leaning against the wall, watching. He reached for her hand. I'm not just grateful, he said. I'm changed. You brought more than a nurse into this home. You brought a new life. And I want to ask you something. She turned to him, a question already rising in her eyes. I want us to be a family. All of us. Not by circumstance, but by choice. Her eyes shimmered. No hesitation. Yes. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just certain. 6 months later, the Morgan residence was almost unrecognizable. The sterile silence that once clung to its walls had been replaced with noise. Human, chaotic, full of life. Laughter echoed down hallways. Crayon murals sprawled across the edge of the kitchen whiteboard. The dining table was no longer a paperwork battlefield, but the site of regular, sticky, juice-stained breakfasts. And on one particular morning, it became a wedding venue. The garden had been dressed in understated celebration. White and blue ribbons tied to trellises, balloons swaying gently in the late summer breeze. Daniel Morgan stood beneath a simple wooden arch, not in a tuxedo, but in a plain dark suit, looking far more like a father than a groom. Which, in truth, he was now both. Claire emerged from the back door, her white dress modest, her hair only beginning to grow back, the soft stubble of new life matching the faint flush in her cheeks. There was no veil, no orchestra, just the quiet steps of someone who had carried real weight and now chose peace. Ethan and Lily walked ahead of her, ring bearer and flower girl. He held a small velvet box. She tossed handfuls of dandelion fluff instead of petals. It was absurd, imperfect, and exactly right. The officiant, an old friend of Daniel's, cleared his throat. "Do you, Daniel Morgan, take Claire Bennett to be your wife?" Daniel's voice, steady but low. "I do. As the woman who gave my son laughter again. As the person who showed me hope isn't weakness. And as the one who made this house a home." Claire's response came without pause. "I do. To the man who stood between a child and despair. To the father who let himself be broken and still chose love. And to the man who taught me that healing doesn't mean forgetting." When they kissed, the children screamed with delight. Later, in the fading light of the reception, guests milled around the yard. Some were family, some former patients' parents, others people they'd met only through the slow crucible of shared grief. It didn't matter. They were here. Dr. Laura Mitchell raised a glass. "To truth," she said, "and to the people who didn't blink when it was hard to look." Then she pulled Daniel aside. "He was sentenced this morning," she said quietly. 15 years. No parole. License revoked. Assets frozen. He'll pay restitution to every family in the suit." Daniel nodded, his face unreadable. "But more importantly," Laura continued, "the law passed last week. Second opinions are now mandatory for all pediatric cancer diagnoses. And no physician can own the lab that processes their patients' results. Ever again." Daniel looked across the lawn, where Ethan and Lily were building what could only be described as a structurally unsafe pillow fort. "They won't know what that cost," he said. "They shouldn't have to," she replied. That night, after the last guests left and the borrowed chairs were stacked, Daniel sat in the quiet with Claire. The kids had fallen asleep on the couch, still in their formal clothes, their arms flung over each other like siblings who never wanted to be apart again. Moonlight filtered through the window. The room smelled faintly of cake and lemonade. "It all started with a razor," Daniel said. Claire turned to him. "You shaved your head, just so a kid wouldn't feel alone." She smiled, a single tear tracing her cheek. "It wasn't about hair," she whispered. "It was about saying, you don't have to face this world looking different and feeling less." Daniel reached for her hand. "He wants to be a doctor, you know. Said it last night." "A good one," she teased gently. He nodded. "One who saves kids." His words. They fell into a comfortable silence. Outside, New York glowed like a city in recovery. Inside, a family, one formed not by blood but by fire, rested whole. Daniel looked down at his son and daughter, because that's what she was now, and said the words he hadn't allowed himself to believe for so long. "We made it." Claire didn't respond. She just held his hand tighter. And somewhere in the dark, two children dreamed, not of hospitals or needles or statistics, but of capes and stethoscopes and planets with too many moons. Because finally, the worst was over, and everything that mattered was just beginning.